In the gleaming towers of corporate America, they teach you about assets and liabilities, profits and losses, but they never teach you the true cost of a soul, or the immeasurable value of silence. Ilara Vance was learning that lesson now, in the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of the 47th floor. The applause felt like a physical force, a wave of sound pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. It was a polite, corporate applause, crisp and uniform, for a victory she had engineered but would never claim. On the small stage at the front of the glass-walled conference room, Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Innovatech Solutions, was beaming, his arm draped over the shoulders of Amelia Croft. Amelia, her Ivy League poise unshaken, her smile a perfect radiant curve, was accepting the promotion to head of strategy. The promotion Marcus had promised to Ilara in his hushed, conspiratorial voice just 3 weeks ago. The promotion that was meant to be the culmination of 6 months of sleepless nights, of deciphering impossible data streams, of pouring every ounce of her intellect into the lifeline known as Project Chimera. Ilara stood motionless, a ghost at the feast. She watched Amelia's eyes, and for a fraction of a second, they met hers across the room. There was no malice in them, no triumphant gloating. There was something far worse, a flicker of calculated pity. It was the look a queen might give to a pawn that had just been sacrificed for the good of the game. Then, the moment was gone, and Amelia turned back to the adoring crowd, her best friend, the one who had held her hand and listened to her fears, forgotten. There were no tears in Ilara's eyes. The shock was too deep, too cold for that. It felt like a slow-motion drowning. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a dull, rhythmic beat against the sharp claps of her colleagues' hands. She could feel the weight of her own voice, the soft, lilting accent of her Appalachian home lodged in her throat like a stone. It was the voice they had so often mimicked in jest, the voice that, according to Marcus, lacked the executive polish for the boardroom. And it was the voice that now refused to make a sound, to scream the injustice that was unfolding before her. Betrayal, she was discovering, wasn't a loud explosion. It was a silent crack in the ice beneath your feet, a fracture that spreads quietly, unstoppably, until everything you stand on gives way, plunging you into the cold, dark water below. And in that suffocating silence, Ilara simply stood and watched and remembered everything. To understand the silence of Ilara Vance, you first have to understand where she came from. Her story didn't begin in the polished marble lobby of Innovatech Solutions, but in a small, forgotten town called Hollow Creek, nestled deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains. In Hollow Creek, the air tasted of coal dust and damp earth, and silence wasn't emptiness. It was a language. It was the quiet respect of men with weary faces after a long shift in the mines. It was the patient hum of cicadas in the thick, humid summers. It was the unspoken understanding between neighbors on their front porches, watching the sun dip below the jagged tree line. Ilara grew up speaking this language, a dialect of observation and careful thought. Her mind, however, was anything but quiet. It was a brilliant, crackling thing, a place where numbers danced and complex patterns unfolded like intricate lace. She saw the world in data streams, in probabilities, in the elegant, undeniable logic that flowed beneath the surface of things. Her ticket out of Hollow Creek was a scholarship, a testament to a mind that couldn't be contained by the town's small horizons. But leaving was never about escaping. It was about a promise, one made on a sagging porch swing to her mother, a woman whose hands were as gnarled as oak roots and whose cough was a constant, gentle rattle in the quiet of their home. "You go out there, Ellie girl," her mother had said, her voice thin but steady, "and you show them that we are more than just this mountain. You build something that lasts." Ilara wasn't just chasing a career. She was on a mission to build a fortress for her family, a life where her mother's biggest worry wasn't the cost of her next prescription. And so, she arrived in the city, a place of gleaming steel and relentless noise, carrying her promise like a fragile bird in her hands. Her accent, the soft musical cadence of her home, came with her. In Hollow Creek, it was the sound of community. At Innovatech Solutions, it was a brand, an immediate, audible marker of her otherness. Her first day was a blur of disorientation. The sheer scale of the building felt like a challenge, its silent elevators ascending floors faster than her heart could settle. She wore her best blouse and a simple black skirt, feeling like a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. The women moved with a sharp, staccato rhythm in their designer heels, their voices cutting through the air with an effortless, practiced authority. The men wore suits that cost more than her father's truck, their laughter booming with a confidence she had only ever seen in movies. When she introduced herself in the initial team meeting, she saw the flicker in their eyes. It wasn't hostility, not yet. It was a subtle recalibration, a quick, silent categorization. She was the charity case, the diversity hire, the girl from nowhere. And then there was Amelia Croft. Amelia was everything Ilara was not. Raised in a wealthy suburb of Boston, educated at Yale, she navigated the corporate world like a yacht sailing through a calm sea. She was beautiful, charming, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear. On Ilara's third day, as she was struggling to understand the unspoken rules of the office coffee machine, Amelia had glided to her side. "It's a beast, isn't it?" she'd said, with a warm, disarming smile. "Let me show you the secret." In that small moment, Amelia became her savior. She took Ilara under her wing, translating the arcane corporate jargon, offering advice on everything from her wardrobe to her reports. "Your analysis is genius, Ilara. Truly," Amelia would say, marking up one of Ilara's drafts. "But you need to package it differently. Use more power verbs. Let's swap 'it seems likely' with 'it is strategically imperative.' See? It's all about the language of confidence." Ilara, starved for connection and validation, absorbed Amelia's every word. She saw her as a mentor, a guide, a true friend. She was grateful, achingly so. When Amelia invited her for after-work drinks, Ilara felt a sense of belonging for the first time. She didn't realize that during these friendly chats, while she was nervously sipping a club soda, she was also laying out the blueprints of her brilliant mind for Amelia to study. She would talk excitedly about a new data parsing technique she'd developed, and Amelia would listen with rapt attention, her eyes shining with what Ilara mistook for admiration. In reality, it was acquisition. Ilara was an untapped mine of intellectual property, and Amelia was patiently, skillfully, extracting the most valuable ore. Ilara viewed their collaboration as a partnership. Amelia saw it as an apprenticeship where she was the master, learning the trade before discarding the teacher. She became the polished, articulate vessel for Ilara's raw, powerful ideas. Their boss, Marcus Thorne, only reinforced this dynamic. Marcus was a man who managed by magazine cover. He believed in the power of image, the narrative of success. He was sharp enough to recognize the pure gold in Ilara's analytics. He would call her into his office, the skyline of the city sprawling behind him like a conquered kingdom, and praise her work in a way that felt both thrilling and demeaning. "Vance, this island. Extraordinary," he'd say, tapping a manicured finger on a spreadsheet she'd spent 72 straight hours perfecting. "You have a golden brain, truly a gift. But your presentation, it's a whisper when I need a roar." He spoke of her talent as if it were some strange, raw element that he, the great alchemist, needed to refine. He would then turn to Amelia, who often sat in on these meetings, and say, "Amelia, you see the power in these numbers. You can make them sing. Work with Ilara, help her shape this into something the board can digest." He wasn't building a team. He was establishing a production line. Ilara was the brilliant, hidden engine, and Amelia was the sleek, beautiful chassis that would carry the final product across the finish line. And Ilara, desperate to prove herself, desperate to make her mother proud, accepted her role. She told herself this was how things worked, that you had to pay your dues, that you had to let someone else be the voice until you earned the right to have your own. She didn't understand that in the silent, predatory world of innovative solutions, a voice that is never used is a voice that is eventually forgotten. The whispers started in early spring, quiet as the hum of the servers in the basement. A budget freeze, a hiring pause. Then, the hushed, anxious conversations by the water cooler about sinking profits and a volatile market. The bright, optimistic hum of Innovatech's solutions had been replaced by the nervous energy of a ship taking on water. It was in this atmosphere of quiet panic that Marcus Thorne called an all-hands meeting and unveiled their last, desperate hope, Project Chimera. The name itself was a warning, a nod to the mythical beast of impossible composition. The project's goal was the acquisition of Blackwood Dynamics, a tech company so secretive it was practically a ghost. It had almost no public footprint, no marketing department, and was run by a reclusive, semi-mythical CEO nobody had ever met. But its portfolio of patents was revolutionary, a treasure chest of next-generation technology that could not only save Innovatech, but catapult it into a new stratosphere. The problem was, Blackwood's financials were a fortress. The best minds at Innovatech, the sharp-suited men with degrees from Harvard and Wharton, threw their most sophisticated models at it and came back with nothing. The company seemed deliberately, almost artistically, undervalued. It made no sense. It was a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the fate of the company depended on solving it. While the senior analysts grew frustrated, their confidence eroding with every failed projection, Alara Vance found her purpose. The noise of the office, the condescending glances and whispered jokes about her accent, all of it faded away. In the quiet solitude of her cubicle, surrounded by the elegant certainty of numbers, she was home. She began to work with a singular, ferocious focus that bordered on obsession. Her colleagues would leave in a river of chatter at 5 p.m., but Alara would remain, the glow of her dual monitors painting pale light on her determined face. The city would glitter to life outside her window, a universe of strangers having dinners and dates and lives, but her entire world was contained in the endless columns of data on her screens. She treated the data not as a set of figures, but as a biography. She listened to its rhythms, searched for its habits, for the story it was trying to tell. She didn't just look at Blackwood's profits. She cross-referenced their patent filings with global supply chain logistics, tracked their minuscule digital footprint across obscure academic forums, and analyzed the career trajectories of the handful of engineers they had ever employed. And all the while, Amelia was her shadow, her constant, caring companion. She would appear at Alara's desk late at night, a welcome interruption in the deep silence, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're a machine, Alara," she'd say, her voice full of feigned concern. "I'm worried you're going to burn out." She would rub Alara's tense shoulders, asking gentle, probing questions. "Any luck with the valuation puzzle? I heard Mark's team hit another dead end." Alara, grateful for the friendship, for the simple human contact, would open up completely. She would turn her screen towards Amelia, her voice alight with passion, and explain her unique methodology. "They're all looking at it wrong, Amelia," she'd say, her accent thickening with her excitement. "They're trying to value the company on what it is now. But the real value, the real story, is in what it's about to become." Amelia would nod, her eyes wide with encouragement, absorbing every word, every theory, every innovative analytical shortcut Alara had devised. One evening, as a storm raged outside, causing the lights in the office to flicker, Amelia rushed to Alara's desk with a look of panic. "Oh my God, Alara, the network has been so unstable. Imagine if there's a surge and your drive gets fried. All this work, gone. Let me just back it up onto my secure drive, please. It's the least I can do. I would just die if anything happened to your work." Exhausted and touched by her friend's foresight, Alara had agreed instantly. She'd watched as Amelia plugged in a sleek, silver external drive, the progress bar on the screen methodically copying months of her life's work. The seed of betrayal wasn't planted in that moment. It was merely being moved to more fertile soil. The breakthrough, when it came, happened at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. The office was tomb silent, the only sound the soft click of her keyboard. Alara had been chasing a ghost in the code, a recurring algorithmic signature in Blackwood's patent applications that didn't match any of their known products. It was a loose thread she couldn't stop pulling. And then, she found it. A deeply buried research paper from a foreign university, co-authored years ago by a young Silas Blackwood. It detailed a theoretical framework for a new kind of data compression that was considered impossible. But the signature in Blackwood's patents wasn't just similar to the theory, it was its practical application. They hadn't just been filing patents for random tech, they had been secretly building the components for a revolutionary technology that would change everything about data storage and transmission. They weren't a hardware company, they were a revolution in disguise. The reason the company was undervalued was because its greatest asset wasn't on the books. It didn't even officially exist yet. A soft gasp escaped Alara's lips. It was the key, the golden key that unlocked everything. It wasn't just about acquiring Blackwood, it was about doing so before they unveiled their technology to the world, before their value skyrocketed into the tens of billions. She had just found a winning lottery ticket lying on the street. Her first instinct, her only instinct, was to share the news with her best friend. She messaged Amelia, her fingers trembling with adrenaline. "I've got it. I've broken it wide open. The whole thing." The next morning, in a small, empty conference room, Alara laid out the entire discovery for Amelia. She showed her the research paper, the hidden algorithm, the intricate web of evidence she had painstakingly woven together. She explained the strategy for the acquisition, a plan so bold and brilliant it had taken her breath away to conceive it. She handed her entire victory, her entire future, to Amelia, her heart swelling with pride and relief. Amelia listened, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock, and finally, to pure, unadulterated awe. She stood up and hugged Alara, a fierce, proprietary embrace. "Alara, you are a genius," she whispered, her voice vibrating with an intensity Alara mistook for shared joy. "An absolute, undeniable genius. We have to take this to Marcus immediately." As Amelia held her, Alara felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had fulfilled her promise. What she didn't feel, what she couldn't see, was the cold, triumphant glint in her best friend's eyes. It was the look of a skilled prospector who had just watched a naive fool lead her to the motherlode. The discovery of Blackwood's hidden asset sent a jolt of electricity through the highest levels of Innovatech. Suddenly, the cloud of despair that had been hanging over the company began to part, revealing a sliver of brilliant, hopeful blue sky. The initial presentation of these findings was scheduled in Marcus Thorne's private boardroom, a space reserved for conversations that could make or break fortunes. Amelia insisted that they present together, arguing that it would show a united, strategic front. Alara, though nervous about public speaking, agreed. She saw it as the perfect embodiment of their partnership. Her data, Amelia's delivery, the two of them, a perfect team. As they stood before Marcus and two senior VPs, Amelia took the lead. She moved with a fluid, confident grace, her voice clear and persuasive. She presented Alara's data, but she wrapped it in a narrative of corporate conquest and visionary strategy. She used the power verbs she had taught Alara, transforming complex analytical concepts into thrilling, digestible bullet points. Alara stood beside her, the silent architect of the entire strategy, occasionally prompted by Amelia to clarify a specific data point. "Alara, could you briefly walk us through the predictive model you built for Blackwood's tech rollout?" Amelia would ask, turning to her with a gracious, inclusive smile. And Alara, her voice soft but sure, would explain the intricate mechanics, her command of the numbers undeniable. She felt a surge of pride, not just in her work, but in their team. She didn't notice how Marcus's eyes stayed on Amelia, how he nodded at Amelia's soaring rhetoric, only glancing at Alara as one might glance at a complex but inanimate tool. When the presentation concluded, the VPs were visibly impressed, their faces lit with a cautious optimism they hadn't shown in months. Marcus stood, his expression unreadable but intense. "Excellent work, ladies. Truly excellent. Amelia, your grasp of the strategic implications is outstanding. That's all for now." As Amelia gathered her notes with a triumphant smile, Marcus added, almost as an afterthought, "Alara, a moment, please." Amelia's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Of course," she said, giving Alara's arm a supportive squeeze. "You were brilliant." Then she was gone, leaving Alara alone in the intimidating expanse of the CEO's inner sanctum. Marcus gestured for her to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his monolithic mahogany desk. The city sprawled out behind him, a breathtaking panorama of power and ambition. For a few moments, he was silent, steepling his fingers and studying her. The analysis, he began, his voice dropping to a more personal, serious tone, was not just brilliant. It was a work of art. I've seen the raw data logs. I see your digital fingerprints all over the breakthrough. Amelia is a fantastic presenter, a natural-born storyteller. But you are the engine. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the recognition she had craved. "Thank you, sir," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "This project will define the future of this company. It's everything. And the person who leads it across the finish line won't just be a hero, they'll be the new head of strategy." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Ilara felt the air leave her lungs. It was the position she had dreamed of, the one that seemed impossibly distant just weeks ago. "I'm telling you this, Ilara, because I believe in merit. I believe in rewarding the mind that does the work," he continued, his voice a low, convincing hum. "But this world, this business, it's not just about the work, it's about perception, it's about power." He paused, letting her absorb the weight of his words. "You have the mind, no one doubts that. But the role requires a leader, someone who can command a room, who can inspire confidence, who can project success." He was walking a delicate line, praising her intellect while simultaneously highlighting her perceived weaknesses. "This project is your crucible, Ilara," he said, his eyes gleaming. "The promotion isn't just a prize for the data. It's a prize for the leader who emerges from this. I want you to lead this. I want you to be that person. See this through. Land this deal, and the job is yours. No questions asked." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Frankly, there would be a powerful narrative in it. The quiet girl from, where was it? Hollow Creek? The one they underestimated. Show them all, Ilara. Show them that a mind from Appalachia can build an empire on the 47th floor. Can you do that? It was a masterstroke of manipulation, appealing directly to her deepest insecurities and her most fervent ambitions. He was offering her not just a job, but a chance to vindicate her entire existence. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking but filled with a newfound resolve. "Yes, I can." As Ilara walked out of his office, the muted gray carpet felt like clouds beneath her feet. She was so euphoric, so dizzy with possibility, that she barely registered the path back to her desk. The title echoed in her mind. Head of Strategy. It was more than a title. It was security for her mother. It was respect. It was the fulfillment of her promise, rendered in gleaming, corporate silver. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to find Amelia. She found her by the coffee station, laughing with one of the VPs. Ilara pulled her aside, her face flushed with excitement. "Amelia, you will not believe what just happened." In the privacy of a small alcove overlooking the building's atrium, Ilara recounted the entire conversation with Marcus, her words tumbling out in a breathless, joyous rush. As she spoke, Amelia's expression transformed into one of pure, radiant delight. "Oh my God, Ilara, he said that? I knew it," she exclaimed, grabbing Ilara's hands and squeezing them tight. "I told you he would see how brilliant you are. This is amazing. Head of Strategy. It's everything you deserve." Amelia's excitement seemed so genuine, so overwhelming, that it swept away any lingering doubts Ilara might have had. She pulled Ilara into a fierce hug. "Okay," Amelia said, pulling back, her face suddenly serious and focused. "Okay, so now we have to make this happen. No mistakes. I am with you 100%. We need to craft the perfect final presentation. You focus on making the strategy absolutely bulletproof, and I'll help you with the delivery, the performance. We'll rehearse it until it's flawless. We're a team, remember. Your win is my win." Ilara looked at her friend, her heart overflowing with gratitude and affection. In that moment, she felt invincible. She had the impossible task, the golden key to solve it, the promise of a glorious reward from her CEO, and the unwavering, absolute loyalty of her best friend to help her achieve it. She was standing on the summit of her world, unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor, and the hand of the person she trusted most was already reaching for the lever. The final week before the board presentation was a blur of frantic energy. Elara lived and breathed Project Chimera. Her cubicle became a fortress of data, its walls covered in printouts of complex financial models and handwritten notes that mapped out every possible contingency. She worked with the precision of a watchmaker and the tenacity of a warrior, refining every calculation, stress-testing every assumption, until the entire strategy was a seamless, bulletproof marvel of logic and foresight. She felt the weight of her promise, of Marcus's challenge, and it fueled her. This work was more than a project. It was the manifestation of her worth, the final, irrefutable argument that she belonged. Amelia, true to her word, became her dedicated partner, her director. She didn't engage with the deep data dives that was Elara's domain, but she excelled at shaping the narrative. She would sit beside Elara, pointing at a complex chart on the screen. "This is brilliant, but it's too dense," she'd say, her tone constructive and helpful. The board members have the attention span of gnats. They don't need to see the engine. They just need to know the car is fast. Let's turn this into a single, powerful infographic. Under Amelia's guidance, Elara's intricate, nuanced analysis was polished and repackaged into a slick, compelling slideshow. Amelia chose the color palette, the fonts, the powerful stock imagery of soaring eagles and rising stock charts. Elara felt a pang of unease watching her complex work being simplified, but she pushed it down, telling herself that Amelia knew this world better than she did. She was grateful for the help. She saw their collaboration as a perfect synergy, her substance and Amelia's style, a combination that was surely unbeatable. The night before the presentation, they rehearsed in an empty conference room until well after midnight. Elara, holding a set of note cards, stumbled over the corporate jargon, her natural Appalachian cadence feeling clumsy and out of place against the sharp, assertive words on the page. Amelia was patient, coaching her, correcting her posture, reminding her to make eye contact. "You've got this, Elara," she said, giving her a reassuring hug before they finally left the silent, sleeping office. "Tomorrow, you're going to be a star." The morning of the meeting, Elara felt a knot of terror and excitement tightening in her stomach. She wore a new navy blue suit Amelia had insisted on helping her pick out, a piece of corporate armor that felt both foreign and empowering. She stood outside the main boardroom, clutching her note cards, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the crucible, the moment she would prove to Marcus, to everyone, and to herself, that she was more than just a quiet girl from Hollow Creek. 5 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, Amelia emerged from a hallway, her face a mask of grave concern. She pulled Elara into a small, private alcove. "Elara, I just came from Marcus's office," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. There's been a change of plans." Elara's blood ran cold. "What? What do you mean?" Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with what looked like sincere regret. "He's nervous. The entire board is here, including Abernathy from the parent company. They're old school, unforgiving," he said. "And please don't take this the wrong way. This isn't about you." He said that your accent, in a high-pressure situation, might be seen as distracting, as unsophisticated. Each word was a carefully placed dagger. He thinks, for a deal of this magnitude, they need a voice that sounds familiar to them, a voice that sounds like money. He wants me to deliver the presentation. The world tilted on its axis. The note cards in Elara's hands suddenly felt like lead weights. "But Marcus promised me," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "He said this was my test." "And it still is," Amelia insisted, grabbing Elara's arms. Her grip was firm, almost painful. "This doesn't change anything about the promotion." He was very clear on that. "This is purely a last-minute strategic decision to get the deal approved. That's all that matters right now. I'll just be your mouthpiece, Elara. A proxy. I will make it so clear that this entire strategy, every brilliant piece of it, came from you. Please, she begged, her eyes wide. Let's not make waves. Let's not give them any reason to doubt the project. We are too close. Trust me. There was no time to think, no time to appeal to Marcus, who was already inside the boardroom. Trapped by the urgency, by her own deep-seated insecurities that Amelia had so expertly weaponized, and by a desperate need to believe her friend, Alara gave a single, numb nod. Her dream of standing at that podium, of claiming her victory, dissolved into dust. She walked into the boardroom and took a seat in a secondary chair against the wall, a staffer's position, while Amelia took her place at the head of the grand, polished table. The presentation began, and it was a performance for the ages. Amelia was transformed. She was no longer just a charming manager. She was a titan of industry, a visionary. She spoke with a passion and authority that was spellbinding. She presented Alara's slides, Alara's numbers, Alara's secret golden key, with the seamless, intimate fluency of someone who had created it all herself. She moved around the room, making eye contact with each board member, her words painting a vivid picture of a triumphant future for Innovatech. Alara watched in a state of surreal, creeping horror. It was like having an out-of-body experience, hearing her most private, brilliant thoughts being broadcast to the world through a stranger's mouth. At first, she waited for the credit, for the moment Amelia would say, "And the credit for this groundbreaking analysis goes to my colleague, Alara Vance." But the moment never came. Amelia used the word "I" relentlessly. When I dug into the data, my analysis revealed, I concluded that the board needed a bolder path forward. The presentation reached its crescendo, and the room was filled with a stunned, impressed silence. Then, a stern-faced, silver-haired man at the far end of the table, Mr. Abernathy, leaned forward. "Miss Croft," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "This is the most brilliant and audacious strategy I've seen in 20 years on this board. The depth of the analysis island, staggering." He peered at Amelia over his glasses. "Tell me, who is the primary architect of this vision?" This was it, the final, undeniable moment of truth. Alara's heart stopped. She saw Amelia pause, a picture of perfect, humble confidence. She saw her glance at Marcus, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Amelia turned her radiant smile back to Mr. Abernathy. "Thank you, sir. That means a great deal," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "It was truly a collaborative process, and my team was incredible. But I am proud to say that I led the strategic development and personally shaped the final vision from its inception." The lie, so perfectly delivered, filled the room, leaving no space for the truth. The board members began to murmur their approval. Someone started to clap, and soon the room erupted in applause, a thunderous ovation directed entirely at Amelia Croft. Marcus was beaming at her, his eyes shining with pride. And in her chair against the wall, Alara Vance finally understood. She had not been a partner, she had been a resource. A mine that had been fully excavated, its riches claimed by another, leaving only a hollow, silent darkness behind. She was completely, utterly invisible. The applause in the boardroom eventually faded, replaced by the excited chatter of board members and executives crowding around their new star, Amelia Croft. They shook her hand, clapped her on the shoulder, their faces alight with the kind of admiration reserved for a conquering hero. Marcus Thorne stood beside her, beaming like a proud father. Alara remained in her chair against the wall, a statue carved from ice. The noise of the celebration was a distant roar, the triumphant sounds of a world she was no longer a part of. She watched as Amelia laughed, her head tilted back, the picture of effortless success. The sight finally broke her paralysis. A cold, quiet resolve settled over her. She needed to hear it from Amelia herself. She waited, every second an agony, until the crowd began to disperse. She intercepted Amelia in the gleaming, empty corridor just outside the boardroom. "Amelia," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it felt like it was clawing its way through a throat full of broken glass. Amelia turned, her celebratory smile still in place, though it faltered slightly when she saw the look on Ilara's face. "Ilara, wasn't that incredible? We did it." She reached out as if to hug her. Alara took a step back. "You didn't mention my name," she stated. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. It was a simple, stark fact hanging in the air between them. Amelia's posture changed. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a cool, impatient weariness. She dropped her hands and let out a small, patronizing sigh. "Oh, Ilara," she said, her voice laced with a condescension that was far more painful than any shout. "Don't be so naive. This isn't a school project where everyone gets a participation trophy. This is a multi-billion-dollar game." "But you promised," Ilara whispered, the words feeling fragile and foolish. "You promised you would tell them it was my work. And what good would that have done?" Amelia shot back, her voice now hard and sharp. "Let's be realistic. You are a brilliant analyst. Nobody on this planet is better with numbers than you are. But look at you. Listen to yourself. Do you honestly think for one second that those old men in that room would entrust the future of this company to someone who sounds like they just stepped off a bus from a coal town? They want to see a reflection of themselves. They want confidence, polish, a voice that sounds like the world they know. You have the engine, Ilara, but I'm the one who knows how to drive the car. I didn't steal your work," she said, taking a step closer, her eyes cold and clear. "I validated it. I took your genius and I made it palatable to the people who matter. I gave it a platform it never would have had otherwise. In a way, you should be thanking me." The cruelty of her logic was breathtaking. She hadn't just stolen Ilara's work. She had stolen her very identity, repackaged it, and then tried to sell it back to her as a favor. Ilara felt a dizzying wave of nausea. The friend she had trusted, the woman she had viewed as a sister, had never existed. In her place was this cold, pragmatic stranger who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone. Shattered, Ilara turned and walked away, her mind clinging to one last, desperate thread of hope. Marcus. He had made a promise. He had looked her in the eye and challenged her to prove herself. He had to make this right. She waited by his office, her body trembling, until he returned, still riding the high of the successful meeting. "Mr. Thorne," she said, stepping into his path, "I need to speak with you about the promise you made me." Marcus's celebratory expression soured into one of annoyance. "Ilara, not now. We're celebrating a huge win." "This is about that win," she persisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "That was my work, my discovery, my strategy. Amelia presented my work." Marcus stopped and looked down at her, his face a mask of disappointment, as if she were a child throwing a tantrum. "Ilara," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "what you did with the data was a fine piece of technical work. It was the foundation, but a foundation is useless without a building on top of it. What Amelia did in that room today, that was leadership. She didn't just present numbers. She created a vision. She commanded respect. She showed every single person in that room that she has the executive presence this role demands." He leaned in slightly. "The promise was for the person who could lead this project to victory. In that room, Amelia proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she is that person. You need to learn that in this business, the person with the idea isn't always the one who gets to sit at the head of the table. Be a team player. Be happy for your colleague. Don't ruin a great day with petty jealousy." He didn't just break his promise. He rewrote its history, gaslighting her into believing she had misunderstood him all along. He dismissed her, turning his back and disappearing into his office, leaving her standing in the hallway, utterly broken. The final thread of hope had snapped. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into a new kind of hell. The story, twisted and reshaped by the office grapevine, had already solidified. Amelia was the brilliant strategist, and Ilara was the jealous, bitter underling who had tried to take credit for her boss's work. The subtle mockery she had endured before now escalated into open ostracism. When she walked to the coffee machine, conversations would abruptly stop. If she sat at a table in the cafeteria, people would quickly finish their meals and leave. She was taken off email chains for the project she had single-handedly created. Her professional existence was being systematically erased. The jokes about her accent returned, but now they were laced with a new cruelty. In a team meeting, when she offered a suggestion, a senior analyst smirked and said, "Well now, I'm not sure the board would approve of that particular delivery." The comment was met with a few stifled snickers. Amelia, sitting at the head of the table, said nothing. She simply looked at Alara with that same calculated pity from the boardroom, the look of a queen observing the struggles of a peasant. Alara was no longer just an outsider, she was a pariah. The silence that had once been her refuge in Hollow Creek, a space for thought and observation, had become the four walls of a prison inside her own mind. She was isolated, discredited, and completely, utterly alone, pushed to the very edge of what a human soul could endure. In the weeks following her promotion, Amelia Croft inhabited her new role as head of strategy with a flawless, predatory grace. She moved into a spacious corner office with a view of the city, chaired meetings with an unshakable confidence, and spoke of Project Chimera as if it had been born fully formed from her own mind. She was the company's rising star, the embodiment of Innovatech's bright future. Yet, a shadow lingered in her new, sun-drenched world, the silent, watchful presence of Alara Vance. Alara was a ghost at the corporate feast, a walking, breathing reminder of the lie upon which Amelia's new kingdom was built. She was quiet, beaten, but she was not gone. And her silence was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of the truth. Amelia would see her in the hallways, head down, or catch Alara's gaze across the open-plan office. And in those eyes, she saw not jealousy, but a deep, unnerving knowledge. Alara was a loose thread that could unravel everything. The final act of their one-sided war was not born of ambition, but of a cold, calculating fear. The witness had to be removed from the crime scene. Amelia did not act alone. Power, she knew, attracted allies. She identified two senior analysts who had been particularly sycophantic since her promotion, the same men who had snickered at Alara in meetings. In a carefully casual conversation over expensive coffees, Amelia planted the seed. "I'm worried about Alara," she said. Her voice a perfect blend of concern and authority. Her attitude has become so negative since the board meeting. "I'm concerned she might become a liability to the project. A person that bitter can be unpredictable." The analysts, eager to prove their loyalty to their new leader, nodded eagerly. They understood the unspoken command. They were to help manage the liability. The plan they devised was simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. They didn't need to sabotage the multi-billion-dollar Chimera deal. The target only needed to be Alara's career. They chose their weapon. A minor but sensitive internal document, a confidential list of proposed departmental budget cuts for the next quarter. It was the kind of document that, if leaked, would cause widespread panic and anger, but wouldn't harm the company's stock price. It was the perfect tool to paint a picture of petty, malicious sabotage. The execution took place late on a Wednesday evening. Alara, like most nights, was one of the last to leave. Her spirit too broken to do anything but retreat into the familiar comfort of her work. One of Amelia's allies, a man with friends in IT, waited an hour after she left. He used her cached network credentials, a ghost of her digital presence, to log into her workstation remotely. With a few keystrokes, he attached the budget document to a new email, sent it to a disposable email address he had created that morning, and then expertly erased the immediate digital footprints, leaving only a clear, damning trail that began and ended with Alara Vance's login ID. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes. The next morning, Alara was sitting at her desk, staring blankly at a spreadsheet, when the instant message popped up on her screen. It was from the head of Human Resources. "Alara, can you please come to conference room 3? Marcus and I need to see you." A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of her depression. She walked the long corridor to the conference room, the cheerful office buzz fading into a dull roar in her ears. Each step felt heavy, as if she were wading through water. She opened the door to find a tribunal waiting for her. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stern disappointment. Beside him was the HR director, a woman with a perpetually severe expression, and across from them sat the grim, unmoving figure of the head of corporate security. The air was glacial. "Alara, have a seat," the HR director said, gesturing to the single empty chair opposite them. Alara sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Ilara," the HR director began, her tone devoid of any warmth, "it has come to our attention that there has been a serious breach of company policy and your non-disclosure agreement. Last night, at 10:47 p.m., a highly confidential document was transmitted from your workstation to an unauthorized external account." She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of an email. Ilara's name and email address were clearly visible in the From field. The attachment was a file named Q4, Budget, Cuts, Confidential, 10LSLSX. I don't understand," Ilara stammered, staring at the page. "I didn't send this. I would never." The head of security spoke for the first time, his voice a flat monotone. "The network logs are unequivocal. The email originated from a session authenticated with your credentials. The action is tied directly to you." "But I was at home," Ilara pleaded, her voice cracking. "I left the office before 9. Someone must have, I don't know, used my computer. This is a mistake. You have to believe me." Marcus Thorne finally spoke, his voice dripping with a cold, paternalistic fury. "Frankly, Ilara, we're disappointed, but not surprised." He looked at her, as if she were a particularly loathsome insect. "Your recent behavior has shown a pattern of deep discontent. You felt you were wronged, that you were entitled to a position you did not earn. A disgruntled employee is a dangerous liability. This is a pathetic act of petty sabotage, and it will not be tolerated." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He didn't even consider her innocence. The frame-up worked so perfectly because it aligned with the false, malicious narrative they had already constructed around her. She was no longer Ilara Vance, brilliant analyst. She was Ilara Vance, the bitter girl from the mountains who couldn't handle being passed over. "Effective immediately, your employment with Innovatech Solutions is terminated for cause," the HR director said, her words a final, brutal judgment. "Your network access has been revoked. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings, and then they will escort you from the premises." The walk back to her cubicle was the longest walk of her life. The security guard, a large, impassive man, followed a few steps behind her. As they moved through the office, a wave of silence spread before them. Everyone stopped working, every head turned. They stared with a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous judgment. They were watching the traitor, the corporate spy, being marched to her execution. He handed her a small cardboard box. She had 5 minutes. With trembling hands, she packed the few items that marked her existence there: a framed photo of her mother, a worn copy of a data science textbook, a small chipped coffee mug from Hollow Creek. As the guard led her toward the elevators, they passed Amelia's corner office. The door was open. Amelia stood there, leaning against the frame, her face a perfect portrait of sorrow. As Ilara passed, Amelia looked her right in the eye and whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, her voice breaking with fake emotion, "Oh, Ilara, how could you?" It was the final, most exquisite turn of the knife. The elevator doors slid open. Ilara stepped inside, the guard's hand lightly on her elbow. She didn't look back. The doors closed, sealing her out of the world she had worked so hard to enter, leaving her alone in the cold, echoing silence with a cardboard box and the smoldering ruins of her life. The bus ride back to Hollow Creek was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every familiar landmark, the rusty water tower, the old church with its leaning steeple, the winding road that cut through the misty, tree-covered mountains, was a monument to the person she used to be, a girl full of fierce, quiet hope. Now, that girl was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out stranger who clutched a cardboard box filled with the pathetic debris of a shattered life. She stepped off the bus into the cool autumn air, which smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a scent that once meant comfort but now felt like a funeral shroud. The city's noise was gone, replaced by a profound silence that echoed the vast, empty space that had opened up inside her. Her mother met her on the porch. She didn't ask what happened. She simply looked at her daughter's face, at the deep, bruised weariness in her eyes, and wrapped her in a hug that was both fierce and fragile. In the silent language of their family, the embrace said everything, You are home. You are safe. You are loved. For weeks, Alara existed in a state of suspended animation. She slept for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, seeking the dreamless oblivion of unconsciousness. When she was awake, she would sit on the porch swing, watching the autumn leaves bleed from green to gold to a brilliant, fiery red before letting go and drifting to the ground. She saw herself in them. She too had burned brightly, and she too had fallen. The brilliant mind that had once danced with algorithms and predictive models was now still. She didn't open her laptop. The thought of looking at a spreadsheet made her physically ill. The promise she had made to her mother felt like a cruel joke, a source of profound, gnawing shame. Her mother cared for her with a quiet, unobtrusive grace, making her soup, bringing her blankets, sitting beside her in the evenings without demanding conversation. She was giving her daughter the one thing she needed, the space to grieve the death of her future. The world of Innovatech, of Marcus and Amelia, seemed a million miles away, a nightmare from another life. The silence she had retreated into was absolute, a fortress against a world that had proven to be too brutal, too dishonest. She was convinced her story was over. Then, one crisp afternoon, nearly a month after her return, the phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, with an unfamiliar area code. Her first instinct was to let it go, to let the outside world remain outside. But her mother was in the garden, and the insistent, piercing sound was a violation of the quiet she had so carefully cultivated. With a sigh of weary resignation, she answered. "Hello?" A voice on the other end paused for a moment, then spoke. It was a man's voice, older, with a low, gravelly timbre and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of the same mountain accent she had tried so hard to hide. "Is this Alara Vance?" he asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Silas Blackwood." The name hit Alara with the force of an electric shock. Blackwood, the name of the project, the name of the company, the source of all her pain. Her mind raced. Were they suing her? Had Innovatech told them she was a corporate spy? She felt a surge of pure panic. I don't know what you want," she stammered. "I don't work for them anymore. I didn't do what they said I did." "I know," the voice said calmly, and that simple phrase stopped her spiraling thoughts cold. "That's why I'm calling. Miss Vance, my company is currently in the final stages of a merger negotiation with Innovatech Solutions. As part of my due diligence, I review everything, personally. I've seen two distinct versions of their strategic proposal." He paused. The first version, the raw data model, and the initial strategic framework, was a masterpiece. It had a rhythm. It had a soul. It was built by someone who doesn't just read numbers but listens to them. The second version, the one they're pushing now, it's slick, it's polished, but it's hollow. The soul is gone. It's like a beautiful car with no engine. Alara was speechless, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles were white. She could barely breathe. Silas Blackwood continued, his voice thoughtful. "Curiosity is my primary business asset, Miss Vance. So I looked into the metadata of the original files. Your name was on them, Alara Vance. And the location data on some of the early drafts was tagged to a network in your hometown, Vance from Hollow Creek." He let out a dry, soft chuckle. "I grew up not too far from there myself, in Ridgefall County. My experience is that a Vance from this part of the country is one of two things, honest or stubborn. And most of the time, they're both. The strategy in those original files felt honest. The people I'm dealing with now, they do not." Tears began to well in Alara's eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a dizzying, overwhelming relief. After weeks of being a ghost, of having her truth denied and her identity erased, this stranger, this mythical CEO, saw her. He had looked at her work, the purest expression of her mind, and he had understood. "I don't buy hollow strategies, Miss Vance. And I don't do business with people who lack integrity," Silas said, his voice turning firm. "I have a feeling that the person who built that engine is the only person who can tell me if the car is worth buying. I'm flying into the county airport in 2 days. I'll be there for a day. I would like to meet with you, if you're willing. I want to hear the story, not their version, yours." The offer hung in the silent air of the small kitchen. It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a promise of redemption. It was something far more valuable. It was a chance to be heard. She started, her voice breaking as the first tear spilled down her cheek. Yes, I'll meet with you." After the call ended, Alara stood by the window, looking out at the familiar mountains. The crushing weight that had been sitting on her chest for a month had not vanished, but for the first time, it felt lighter. The fortress of silence she had built around herself had just had a door kicked open from the outside. In the reflection of the window pane, she saw her own face, pale and tear-streaked. But for the first time in a long time, there was a light in her eyes. It was a tiny, fragile spark, like a single ember glowing in a field of cold ash. But it was there. The story was not over. A new chapter was about to begin. The meeting was set for a small, unassuming diner off the main highway, the kind with worn vinyl booths and the lingering smell of black coffee and fried bacon. It was a place from Alara's world, not his. A deliberate choice she would later understand was a sign of respect. She arrived early, clutching her old laptop bag, her heart a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest. She half expected a fleet of black cars to pull up, but instead, a dusty, 10-year-old pickup truck parked out front. A man stepped out. He was older than she expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with a weathered face, calloused hands, and intelligent, piercing blue eyes. He wore a faded flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and scuffed work boots. He looked less like a reclusive tech billionaire and more like the man who ran the local hardware store. This was Silas Blackwood. He slid into the booth opposite her, offering a warm, calloused hand. His handshake was firm, straightforward. "Alara Vance," he said, his voice the same gravelly timbre from the phone. "Thank you for coming. Coffee?" He ordered 2 black coffees from a waitress who called him on, and for a few minutes he just sat, observing her, not with scrutiny, but with a calm, patient curiosity. "My grandfather was a coal miner," he said suddenly, as if it were the most natural way to begin a business meeting. "He used to say you can tell more about a person by what they don't say than by what they do. I've found that to be true in boardrooms as well. So, tell me your story, the quiet parts too." And so, she did, tentatively at first, then, with a growing sense of catharsis, Alara laid out the entire history of Project Chimera. She didn't just tell him, she showed him. She opened her old laptop, the one she hadn't touched in a month, and pulled up her original files. She showed him her notebooks, the pages filled with her frantic, sprawling handwriting, the complex equations and mind maps where her ideas were born. She walked him through the discovery of the golden key, her voice regaining its old fire as she explained the elegant logic of her analysis. Then she showed him the polished, hollowed-out presentation Amelia had created, pointing out the subtle but critical details that had been sanded down and simplified for corporate consumption. She told him of Marcus's promise, Amelia's betrayal in the boardroom, and the final brutal efficiency of the frame-up. She presented the facts of her downfall with the same dispassionate clarity she used to analyze data, letting the evidence speak for itself. Silas listened without interruption, his sharp eyes moving from her face to the screen to the notebooks. He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He offered something far better, comprehension. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, slowly stirring his coffee. "They didn't just steal your work, Miss Vance," he said finally, his voice low and firm. "They stole its language. They took something that had the complexity and honesty of a mountain stream and turned it into processed, bottled water. Slick, sterile, and tasteless." He looked directly at her. "In my world, integrity is the only asset that can't be reverse-engineered or acquired in a hostile takeover. They don't have it. You do. And right now, that makes you the most valuable person in this entire deal." The validation in his words was so powerful, so absolute, that Alara felt a month's worth of shame and humiliation begin to dissolve. He didn't just believe her. He understood the very nature of the violation. Silas then pushed a slim, unmarked, high-end laptop across the table. "This is a secure machine. It's connected directly to my company's private servers. Innovatech has shared their financials with us as part of the due diligence for the merger. I want you to look at their books from our side of the table. Look at them as the person they are trying to fool. See if their story holds up." A fire she thought had been extinguished forever roared back to life inside her. This was not just a chance to be heard, it was a chance to fight back. For the next 48 hours, Ilara barely slept. Working from the quiet of her childhood bedroom, she dove into Innovatech's financials with a renewed, almost vengeful ferocity. But now, she had a new, crucial advantage. She was looking at the company from the outside in, with the privileged data of the acquirer. She cross-referenced the numbers they shared with Blackwood against their public filings, and the deep institutional knowledge she already possessed. On the second night, fueled by coffee and a burning need for the truth, she found it. It wasn't a single, glaring error, but a pattern, subtle and insidious, hidden in the dense forest of numbers. A series of inflated invoices from shell corporations she had never heard of. Irregularities in the capital expenditure accounts, funds allocated for projects that she knew had been canceled. A pattern of financial movement that was designed to look like aggressive investment, but when she mapped it out, revealed a slow, systematic siphoning of company funds. It all pointed in one direction: Marcus Thorne. The merger, she realized with a jolt of ice-cold clarity, wasn't just about saving the company. For Marcus, it was about survival. He was using the massive, complex acquisition of Blackwood Dynamics as a financial smokescreen, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to bury his years of embezzlement in an avalanche of new, legitimate accounting. Amelia, in her blind ambition and focus on the surface-level glory, had never bothered to look deep enough to see the rot at the core. Ilara presented her findings to Silas the next day. He looked over her analysis, a grim, knowing expression on his face. He wasn't surprised. His instincts had told him something was deeply wrong. Her data had just provided the irrefutable proof. So, the captain isn't just steering a sinking ship, Silas mused. He's the one who's been drilling holes in the hull all along. This changed everything. Simply walking away from the deal wasn't enough. That would leave Marcus and Amelia in charge, free to find another way to cover their tracks. It wouldn't be justice. A new plan began to form, a strategy far more intricate and satisfying than simple revenge. "We don't kill the deal," Ilara said, the words coming to her with absolute certainty. "We use it. We proceed to the final negotiation. We let them think they've won." Silas looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. He saw the shift in her. The victim was gone. In her place was a strategist, a hunter. "We let them walk right into the center of the stage," Silas finished her thought, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "And then we turn on all the lights." The alliance was forged. Their goal was no longer just to clear Ilara's name. It was to use the final merger meeting as a perfectly designed trap, a public stage where the truth would not only be revealed, but where justice would be delivered, swift and undeniable. Ilara was no longer just fighting for her past. She was now in command of her future and the future of the company that had cast her out. She was preparing for war. The main boardroom at Innovatic Solutions was arranged for a coronation. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the crystal water glasses and the silver pens laid neatly beside the signature pages of the merger agreement. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and smug self-satisfaction. Marcus Thorne was at his most charming, telling an anecdote that had the board members chuckling. Amelia Croft, seated at his right hand, looked every bit the corporate queen. She wore a striking crimson dress, a splash of victory against the muted tones of the room, her smile bright and unwavering. They were moments away from closing the deal that would not only save the company, but would cement their legacies. All that remained was the final formality, the arrival of the famously reclusive Silas Blackwood to sign the papers. There was a palpable buzz of anticipation. The board members, titans of industry themselves, were eager to finally meet the man who had built a technological empire from the shadows. They expected an entourage of lawyers, a display of power befitting his mythic status. Marcus checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes, a bead of sweat on his brow, the only sign of his underlying tension. He wanted this done. He needed this done. Right on the hour, the heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom swung open. A single man walked in. He was not what they expected. Dressed in simple, dark trousers and a plain gray shirt that looked like it came from a department store, Silas Blackwood carried with him an aura of quiet, unshakable authority that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with substance. The room fell silent, the board members straightening in their chairs. But it wasn't just Silas who commanded their attention. Stepping into the room just behind him, moving with a calm, deliberate grace, was Alara Vance. The transformation was absolute. The timid, heartbroken girl who had been escorted from this building in shame was gone. In her place stood a woman composed of ice and steel. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored black dress. Her hair was pulled back, accentuating the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. Her expression was serene, neutral, but her eyes held a cold, clear fire that swept across the room and settled on Marcus and Amelia. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air out of the room. Amelia's radiant smile dissolved, her face draining of all color, leaving only a mask of pure, horrified disbelief. She made a small, involuntary movement, as if to shrink back into her chair. Marcus Thorne froze, his hand halfway to his water glass, his face tightening into a knot of fury and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" one of the board members finally sputtered, looking at Marcus for an explanation. Silas Blackwood ignored the question. He walked to the head of the table, taking the seat reserved for him. Alara sat to his right, placing a sleek, secure laptop on the polished table before her. She didn't look at anyone, her focus entirely on the machine in front of her. Marcus, struggling to regain control, forced a tight, brittle smile. "Mr. Blackwood, a distinct pleasure to finally meet you in person," he began, his voice straining to sound normal. "I see you've, brought a guest. I must inform you, this is a confidential final signing for board members and key executives only." Silas met his gaze, his blue eyes as cool and clear as a winter sky. "Mr. Thorne, this is no guest," he said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "This is Alara Vance, my lead strategic advisor for this acquisition." He gestured toward Alara. "She will be conducting the final review of the key strategic assumptions before we proceed. The deal moves forward, or dies, entirely on her recommendation." The statement landed with the force of a detonation. In a single sentence, the entire power dynamic of the room had been violently inverted. The fate of the company, the careers of Marcus and Amelia, the billions of dollars on the table, all of it now rested in the hands of the woman they had destroyed. Before Marcus or a stunned Amelia could protest, Alara connected her laptop to the room's main projector. Amelia's final, triumphant slide Innovatic and Blackwood. A new horizon vanished, replaced by a screen filled with the dense, intricate lines of Alara's raw data models. She stood, her movements fluid and economical. She looked not at Marcus or Amelia, but directly at the assembled board members. When she spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. The Appalachian accent was still there, a faint musicality beneath the words, but the hesitant softness was gone. It was now the sound of pure, cold, undeniable authority. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Alara Vance. For the next 10 minutes, I will be walking you through the critical strategic risks that were omitted from the presentation you received on this merger." She clicked a button, and the screen shifted to a new chart. Slide 7 of the previous presentation, for example, claimed a 30% market synergy based on shared supply chains. It was an optimistic and, frankly, lazy projection. Her eyes flickered toward Amelia for a barest fraction of a second. What it failed to account for were the cascading sovereign risks associated with your primary cobalt supplier, a vulnerability that was explicitly flagged in your own internal Q3 risk audit, but was conveniently ignored in the final analysis. My model, which accounts for this, projects a synergy of no more than 12%, with a significant downside risk of total supply chain collapse in the event of regional instability. She continued, her voice never rising, her command of the facts absolute. One by one, she dismantled the polished, hollow narrative that Amelia had presented in this very room. She exposed the overvalued assets, the underestimated integration costs, the technological incompatibilities that had been glossed over with corporate jargon. She used their own internal data, her data, to methodically and dispassionately gut the very strategy they were celebrating. It was a masterclass in intellectual demolition. Amelia sat frozen, her face pale, fumbling for answers that she didn't have. She had only ever understood the surface of the work she had stolen. She had no defense against its creator. She would start to speak, well, the interpretation we chose. But Alara would cut her off, not with a raised voice, but with a new, more damning piece of data. Interpretation doesn't change the underlying mathematics, Miss Croft, Alara stated calmly, without malice, which was somehow infinitely more devastating. The board members, who had arrived ready to sign and celebrate, now looked pale and grim. They were staring at Marcus and Amelia with expressions of dawning suspicion and outright anger. They were beginning to realize that they hadn't been presented with a brilliant strategy. They had been sold a beautifully packaged lie. Alara concluded her presentation and sat down, the room sinking into a heavy, suffocating silence. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused anyone of theft. She hadn't needed to. She had simply reclaimed the truth, and in doing so, had seized total control of their world. The stage for the final act was now set. The silence that followed Alara's presentation was heavier and more profound than any applause. The board members, moments ago relaxed and ready to celebrate, now sat rigid in their chairs, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning fury. They looked from Alara's cold, hard data on the screen to the pale, stricken face of Amelia Croft, and then to Marcus Thorne, upon whom a dozen pairs of accusatory eyes now rested. Marcus, a creature of pure, blustering ego, was the first to break. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is a farce," he boomed, his voice straining to project an authority that had already abandoned him. "This is nothing but the vindictive slander of a disgruntled former employee, a woman we fired for cause, for attempting to steal company data. You cannot possibly entertain this circus." Amelia, seeing her entire future dissolving before her eyes, tried to rally. "He's right," she said, her voice thin and reedy, a pale imitation of the confident tone she had used an hour earlier. "Her models are unconventional. They're based on aggressive, outlier-focused interpretations. We chose a more stable, conservative path." Her words trailed off into nothingness. They sounded hollow even to her own ears. They were flies batting against a hurricane of facts. Before the board could devolve into a chaotic argument, Silas Blackwood raised a single, calm hand. "Mr. Thorne is correct about one thing," he said, his quiet voice instantly commanding the room's attention. "This matter goes far beyond a simple disagreement over strategic projections." He turned his steady, piercing gaze to Alara and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The floor was hers once more. Alara stood, and a new, more profound gravity seemed to settle over her. The cold fire in her eyes was replaced by a somber, solemn light. "My termination from this company," she began, her voice even and clear, "was not the beginning of this story, but a necessary measure to prevent its discovery. The flaws in the strategy you were shown were not merely errors of judgment. They were a deliberate and necessary distraction designed to conceal a far deeper corruption." She clicked the remote, and the screen changed. The complex strategic models were gone, replaced by a stark, terrifyingly simple flowchart of interconnected corporate entities. Arrows, representing wire transfers, snaked between Innovatech and a web of shell corporations with unfamiliar names. "For the past 5 years," Alara continued, her voice narrating the slow, systematic crime, "Mr. Thorne has been using a network of ghost vendors and inflated capital expenditure projects to embezzle more than $20 million from Innovatech Solutions, A wave of audible gasps and shocked murmurs swept through the room. Amelia looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a new dawning horror, a sudden understanding of what she had allowed herself to be a part of. He was running out of places to hide the discrepancies, Alara explained, her voice as calm and certain as a physician delivering a terminal diagnosis. Project Chimera, for him, was never about growth. It was a lifeline. A merger of this size and complexity, especially with a private, labyrinthine company like Blackwood Dynamics, would create enough financial chaos to hide his crimes forever. He wasn't just buying Mr. Blackwood's technology. He was buying his clean, complex balance sheet as a place to bury his secrets. She turned her gaze, for the first and only time, directly onto Amelia. The look was not one of hatred, but of a profound, sorrowful judgment. And Miss Croft, in her laudable ambition to polish my raw data, became the perfect, unwitting accomplice. My original analysis, in all its messy, obsessive detail, contained the flags. The anomalies and outliers she so efficiently erased were the very breadcrumbs that pointed to this fraud. Her ambition didn't just lead her to steal credit, it led her to sweep the real crime scene clean. Lies. These are unsubstantiated, malicious lies. Marcus roared, his face now a blotchy, desperate red. You have no proof. That is where you are mistaken, Mr. Thorne, Silas Blackwood said, his voice cutting through Marcus's tirade. He slid a thick, spiral-bound report down the polished table to Mr. Abernathy, the lead board member. Based on Miss Vance's initial findings, I commissioned my own team of forensic accountants to conduct a preliminary, overnight investigation into the due diligence data you provided us. He let that sink in. That report is their findings. It corroborates every single word Miss Vance has said and details the precise path of the first $12 million of stolen funds. The proof is all there, in black and white. Mr. Abernathy opened the report. He read the executive summary, his face growing colder and harder with every line. The other board members leaned in, reading over his shoulder. The last of Marcus Thorne's world crumbled into dust. There was no escape. The numbers, the language that Alara understood better than anyone, had told their honest, brutal story. Abernathy closed the report with a soft, final thud. He looked up, his eyes locking on Marcus, not with anger, but with a look of pure, cold contempt. He said nothing to him. Instead, he turned to his personal assistant, who stood pale and shaken by the door. Get corporate security to this room immediately, he ordered, his voice low and lethal. Seal Mr. Thorne's and Miss Croft's offices, and get our chief legal counsel on the phone. Now. The end was swift and silent. 2 uniformed security guards entered the room, their faces impassive. They flanked Marcus, who seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit, all the bluster and arrogance gone, replaced by the pale, clammy look of fear. Another guard stood by Amelia, who was now openly weeping, her face buried in her hands, her crimson dress a garish splash of color in the funereal atmosphere of the room. They were asked to stand, and they were escorted out of the boardroom they had commanded just an hour before. Alara watched them go. There was no triumph in her expression, no celebratory glint in her eyes. There was only a profound, somber sense of closure. She had sought justice for a personal betrayal, but in her relentless pursuit of the truth, she had uncovered a deeper cancer and, in doing so, had saved not one, but 2 companies. As the doors closed behind her former tormentors, a heavy, necessary silence settled over the room. It was the silence of a reckoning. The silence after a storm has finally, devastatingly, passed. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound, tomb-like silence filled the boardroom. Marcus and Amelia were gone, swallowed by the sterile corridors and the grim-faced security guards, leaving behind only the lingering scent of their expensive perfume and shattered ambitions. The remaining board members sat stunned, the architects of a kingdom who had just discovered its foundations were rotten to the core. The billion-dollar merger, their great hope, was now a toxic asset, irrevocably tainted by fraud. Mr. Abernathy, the elder statesman of the board, looked defeated, his face pale and etched with the deep lines of stress. He looked across the table at Silas Blackwood, his voice a weary rasp. "The deal is dead, of course. We understand. Frankly, after this revelation, the company itself may not survive the fallout. You should walk away, Mr. Blackwood. We are radioactive." Silas listened, his expression unreadable. He let the weight of Abernathy's despair settle in the room before he finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "The deal as it was written is dead. You are correct," he conceded. "The version of Innovatech you believed you were running is also dead." He paused, letting his words land. "But the company's true assets, the brilliant engineers, the infrastructure, the patent portfolio your teams have built over the years, those are very much alive. What this company has lacked is not talent. It has been a catastrophic failure of integrity, a failure of leadership." He leaned forward slightly. "So, I will make you a new offer. Not a merger between equals, but a full acquisition. Blackwood Dynamics will purchase the controlling interest in Innovatech Solutions, effective immediately. We will absorb your assets, your staff, and your liabilities. The price will be a fraction of what we originally discussed, a fire sale price that reflects the damage your leadership has done. You will accept it because the only alternative is bankruptcy and total collapse. We will cleanse this place and build something better from the salvage." The board had no choice. It was not an offer. It was a lifeline, thrown to them as they were drowning. Abernathy, looking years older than he had that morning, gave a slow, tired nod. "And who will you install to run this new division?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. Silas Blackwood did not answer directly. He simply turned his head and looked at the woman sitting beside him. In his gaze was a profound, unshakable confidence. The new president and CEO of the division, formerly known as Innovatech Solutions, he announced to the silent room, will be the one person who saw the truth when no one else could be bothered to look. The one person who demonstrated the intelligence to uncover the problem and the integrity to see it through. The new CEO is Elara Vance. A few weeks later, Elara stood in the center of the 47th floor corner office. It was the same office where Marcus had made his hollow promise, the same space that had been the ultimate symbol of her ambition and her betrayal. It was hers now. The massive mahogany desk was still there, but she had cleared it of all of Marcus's self-congratulatory awards and photos. In their place, sitting on a corner of the vast, polished surface, was a single object. A small, cheap ceramic mug from a diner in Hollow Creek, its rim slightly chipped. It was a reminder, an anchor. She looked out the vast window at the sprawling city below. It no longer looked like an unconquerable fortress. It looked like a network, a system of interconnected points, a living set of data that she now understood. Her journey had not been about leaving Hollow Creek behind, but about bringing its strengths with her. They had mocked her accent, but it was the quiet, observant nature of her home that had allowed her to listen to the whispers in the data. They had belittled her simplicity, but it was her straightforward, honest approach that made her incapable of ignoring the rot she found. Her supposed weaknesses had been her greatest, most underestimated weapons all along. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her quiet endurance for acceptance. But they were wrong. Her silence had not been a retreat, it had been a tactical position. It was in that silence that she processed, analyzed, and planned. It was in that silence that she had found the strength to answer a fateful call and the courage to forge an alliance. It was in that silence that she had gathered the evidence, piece by piece, that would ultimately bring an empire of lies to its knees. She thought of the lessons they teach in the gleaming towers of corporate America about assets and liabilities, profits and losses. She had learned a different lesson. She had learned that the most valuable asset is the truth. The most crippling liability is a lack of integrity. And the greatest profits are the ones that can't be quantified in a quarterly report. Justice, vindication, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge of one's own worth. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking, they are reloading. The shadows in these glass towers hide many more stories of ambition and consequence. Join us next time as we uncover another